So thank you for everyone for joining our second in this series of Torah from Israel, a really important way to connect and support and just be together as a people right now to learn. And we have the great zchut of learning from someone who for me is one of the most important Torah voices that I read in the world right now. And I don't say that as flattery or as hyperbole. Rabbi Zach Truboff is he's an educator, he's a writer. He just wrote a book, Torah Goes Forth from Zion, Essays on the Thought of Rav Kook and Rav Shagar. And he serves as the director of rabbinic education for the International Beit Din, where he teaches about the halachic approaches that the Beit Din uses to free agunot. This is very, very important work. And his thinking and his Torah is like so deep. And this last time I was in Israel, I sought him out. I said, Zach, I just need to spend time with you. I need to just think through you. And it was some of the most valuable Torah thinking, framing time I've had in many, many years. He possesses deep Torah knowledge, deep knowledge of philosophy, psychoanalysis, literature. Like he's amazing. And I'm excited. I want his Torah to go forth. So this is a good opportunity to bring some of his Torah and thinking into our community. And I'm very grateful to him. And of course, we just daven for him and his family's continued safety and calm in Yerushalayim, and for the safety and strength of all the Jewish people in Israel and across the world. And today's learning should be a zechut for our continued protection and strength as we deal with the challenges of this moment. So with that, I give it over to you, Rabbi Zach Truboff.
Thank you, Rabbi Hart. I mean, those are awe-inspiring words, and it's just, I draw tremendous inspiration from your rabbinic leadership, your passion, your curiosity, and your depth, throughout all of this. And I like to think of myself as a thinker, but one of the things that you come to realize in times of crisis, in times of trauma, is that there's not a whole lot of thinking to be had. And I don't mean that in the sense that like people offer superficialities to the dilemmas. That's true. But I mean that in a time of crisis or trauma, you actually cannot think, right? Like in any attempt to try to put words out there, even Torah words, right? It often, or maybe always, will fall short to a certain extent because they can't really grasp the magnitude of what has taken place. And trauma and crisis takes time before you can actually say something real about it. And part of the reason for that too, I'll just note, is that the Rambam says in Hilchot Taniyot, laws of fasts, that when a crisis befalls a community, right, what is the Jewish response? The community is supposed to fast and it's supposed to pray. And most importantly, it's supposed to do tshuva, because the Rambam understands that crisis may be the only opportunity we ever get to actually look inside at ourselves and try to change. Doesn't mean we usually do that. I mean, usually, the challenge of crisis is to keep pretending like the stories we've been telling ourselves about the world totally still make sense, right? But the Rambam understands that the challenge of crisis is to actually turn inward. But that process, it can't happen in a day, it can't happen in a week, it can't even happen in a couple of weeks. So I want to just sort of preface that right from the get-go. Right, if there is a Jewish response to crisis, and again, it sounds trite, but it is also true, is that we don't think per se, but we do, right? We act. We know what halacha demands of us, or we know what the mitzvot are demanded of us, and we do. And I think, in a certain sense, that is the salvation that Torah offers us in these moments. And Rabbi Hart, when you went, to visit the family, to show solidarity, that have undergone a terrible loss due to a hate crime. Again, I'm sure you thought a lot about it, but again, what guided you there is that you knew that's where you were supposed to be. And so much of what goes on right now is, again, like, we may try to think, but it is often about following where we think we're supposed to be and trying to do what we think we're supposed to do. So I guess I offer that as preface, just because, as I said, I'm somebody who tries to think, but I'm also recognizing how much that can fall short at the current moment. And what I would like to share with you guys, with you, is a drasha by the Piasetzner Rebbe, the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, which I found myself turning to over the last 2 weeks to try to make sense of where we are at right now. And for me too, part of my motivation for turning to this drasha and also trying to think to do in this time is that my family had a bar mitzvah this past Shabbat. It was my second son's bar mitzvah. It was under profoundly complicated circumstances. Most of our family and friends could not be there. And that was particularly hard for us because my oldest son's bar mitzvah was during the first month of COVID, during the first COVID lockdown here in Israel. So even less of our friends and family were able to be there for that. That first bar mitzvah was 15 of us outside. This bar mitzvah was a little bit more, but from the outbreak of the war, every day I was, asking myself, like, can we do this? And like, we have to do this. My son, whose bar mitzvah was this past week, he was somebody who during COVID probably it hit him the hardest. And I was deeply concerned that, trauma, tragedy, suffering tends to take so much away from us. And I didn't want to let this be taken away from him. And so I found myself turning to Torah again to sort of with that in my mind and trying to again make sense of the moment that we're in right now. Now, part of the reason I turned to the Piasetzner Rebbe is not necessarily because I think our moment is like the Holocaust, though there are certainly emotional resonances that are similar between the Holocaust and now, but they're obviously not the same historically, and I want to stress that from the from the get-go. But what I have always appreciated about the Piasetzner Rebbe, right? So the Piasetzner Rebbe, fairly important Hasidic Rebbe in Warsaw from before World War II. He's called Piasetzner. That's the town he's originally from. It's a little bit of outside of Warsaw. He's an important leader. And when the Nazis invade Poland in 1939, right, they formed the ghetto in Warsaw very soon afterwards. The Rebbe becomes a spiritual leader in the ghetto, primarily to his Hasidim, but to other Jews there as well. And he tries to maintain some sort of semblance of religious life. Because that's what a Jew is supposed to do, even under the most trying of circumstances. And part of that entails him giving drashot every week to his Hasidim. The notes of those drashot are collected and basically buried. They're buried in milk cans under the ground in the ghetto, along with other writings that were put together by Jews during those years of the ghetto as a way of documenting sort of what Jews were actually doing during that time, how their lives still had meaning and purpose and creativity and culture in a sense. And his drashot from those years in the ghetto were only discovered afterwards and then later printed. But what I most appreciate about the Piasetzner Rebbe is that, again, he is going through the unimaginable, right? And for me, at least living in Israel the last 2 weeks, certainly the 2 weeks ago, there was a lot of the unimaginable taking place, just things that you can't grasp, right? Things that you see the words on the news and they just don't make sense to you because they're so far outside of the frame of the way of your everyday experience of the world. That was that week for me. Now things are sort of somewhat kind of maybe back to a little bit of a sense of normalcy, but that was the continual experience in the Warsaw Ghetto. And what happens in times of crisis and trauma and tragedy and suffering, and I know this firsthand as a rabbi, is that when most rabbis get up there to speak on Shabbat, right, most of what they offer is what we call in Hebrew sismaot, right, which means slogans, right? They offer sort of the standard lines that people expect to make them feel better, to provide inspiration, right? So there's a lot of slogans, a lot of superficiality, because that's often all you have to offer at a time of crisis. But ultimately what you find is that there's very little Torah, right? And the reason for that is because Torah needs to be something true, right? The only Torah we have is a Torah MS, right? It has to be something true. And it is very difficult to say something true in the hardest and most difficult of moments. But what the Piasetzner Rebbe does is he actually manages to achieve that in his drashot. He actually manages to say something true, even under the most difficult circumstances. And he never really relies on slogans or inspiration or just telling everybody it's going to be okay. He can't do that. He won't do that because when he gets there up there on Shabbat morning, he's there to teach Torah. That's his obligation. And the drasha that I particularly was drawn to is a drasha I think from 1941, Parshat Noach, That was the parsha for the bar mitzvah, but it was the one that I had been spending a lot of time thinking about. The P.S. Hetzner Rebbe opens the drush on Parshat Noach by citing a Rashi who makes a comparison between Noach and Abraham. And I apologize, I had a technical issue and I wasn't able to get the text on the screen. So I'm going to just write them. I'll say them. And then if people have questions or want to clarify anything, please, don't hesitate to jump in. So I'll just open it up first. Normally, when we think about sort of the contrast between Avram and Noach, right, how do we typically understand it, right? What's the difference between them, right? They're similar. I'll just note they're both called Sadiq, right? But there's also a difference between them. How do we typically understand the difference between them?
Well, in Rashi's commentary, I don't know if he was speaking for himself, I don't recall, or quoting someone else, that if Rashi had lived in the times of Abraham, he would have been shum klum, nothing, garnished.
Right. So that's what we learn when we're kids. Exactly that point. Sadiq tamim haya b'doratav, right? Right. That he was righteous, he was whole in his generation. But if he had lived in Abraham's generation, he wouldn't have been considered so righteous. And usually the example that's brought, even though that's citing Rashi's citing the Gemara, if I remember correctly, but usually the way we're taught to understand that difference is that when God tells Abraham he's going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Amorah, how does Abraham respond? Right? Abraham responds not by saying, wow, God, I'm so glad you're going after those wicked people. We should get rid of them so that my descendants will be able to inherit the land, that we won't have to have those wicked people here, right? That would be the natural response we would expect from Abraham, right? This is a good thing. Instead, Abraham argues that if there are righteous people in the city, you should save everybody. He's not even just concerned about the righteous. He's actually concerned about the wicked as well, ironically. That's how radical Abraham is in that moment. And he argues with God, right? He fights with God to try to save not just the righteous, but the wicked too. When we look at Noach, of course, when God tells Noach he's going to destroy the world because it's wicked, how does Noach respond? Right? With silence, right? There's no argument, there's no debate, there's no nothing, right? It's just, okay, God, gotcha, right? So that difference is obviously very striking to us. Anybody who reads the Parshiot back to back, very much picks up on that. Rachel, I see you had a question?
No, I was just going to add that Noah is very much on his own. It's him and his family, sort of against the whole world. I mean, not only does he not argue for them, but he doesn't try to help anybody else. He doesn't try to explain to anybody else. He's not like, going to Nineveh and trying to change things. Yes. He's just he exists on his own very much.
Exactly. Whereas Avram is still involved with others, right, constantly. Right. And again, there's all sorts of midrashic interpretation about Avram converting people, spreading the word of God. But even without that, he's very involved with others, right? Like he's engaged them in ways that Noach is passive and really completely, on his own. Right. So that's the classic distinction that we're often made aware of. But there's actually another Rashi right there, which we often miss, that the PSS Rebbe is actually going to focus on. And what that Rashi focuses on is the way in which Avraham and Noach are described in terms of walking with God, let's say, right? So the two different psukim that describe this, right? The one that describes Noach is Elohim et Elohim hitalech Noach, right? That sort of Noach follows after God, where later on, when Avraham is being described about him, it says Asher hitalachti lefanav. Right, that Avram actually walks in front of God. Right, that's the distinction here. And here's how Rashi understands what the difference between those two positions means. He says, Noach hayat tzarich sad letamcho. Right, Noach walks behind God because Noach needs God's assistance. He needs God's help. But Avram walks in front of God, right? Because Avraham literally walks by his own strength and righteousness, right? Me'elav, from himself. He doesn't actually even need God's help in a sense. Now, if we think about this for a moment in terms of sort of just the actual narratives themselves, right? When we say that Noach needs help, Well, part of the way that comes from God, part of the way that comes through is that when God tells Noah he's going to destroy the world, he doesn't just end there, right? He gives Noah these extremely detailed instructions about what he's going to build and what it's going to look like and what the dimensions are going to be and what's going to be brought into the ark, right? And basically, Noah needs God's assistance to be told exactly what to do, to the extent that even when it seems like Noah could have left the ark, pretty early on after, it lands in Har Ararat, right? Noah seems to take weeks, if not months, to finally leave until God finally tells him, "Say mina teva," right? Leave the ark, right? Noah needs a lot of help from God, a lot of assistance, a lot of planning, a lot of support to get through what's going on here. What's different about Avraham is throughout the whole narrative of Lech Lecha and Vayera, Avraham really seems to be on his own, right? Just to sort of play up the parallel here, when God tells Avraham he's going to leave, his homeland, his father's house, everything that he's known behind, God doesn't even tell Abraham where he's going to go. He says, "El Haaretz Asher Areka," right? Like that's as much information as Abraham gets, right? Abraham's basically got to just go wandering and be completely on his own, right? How more on your own could you be than to be told to go and not know where you're actually supposed to go, right? And to a certain extent, that captures Abraham's greatness, is that even when Abraham has no idea what he's supposed to do, how he's supposed to do, how he's going to get through things.
I'm listening to a podcast, so I don't mean to be...
Sorry? Okay. Avraham, again, like even without the instructions, even without the support, Avraham continues to find a way to keep moving forward no matter what. And as we know, throughout Avraham's life, there are all these profound moments in which there's so much uncertainty, moments in which we would all ask ourselves, how are we going to get through this, right? Famine, your wife being kidnapped, God telling you to, sacrifice your son, your nephew being kidnapped, right? Fighting against larger armies, right? These things all seem impossible. Yet in each stage, Avraham just does it. And again, oftentimes without God telling him what to do. There's something about Avraham that enables him to kind of walk on his own, right? Even when it seems like impossible to do so. I'll use an example here. One of my favorite quotes from Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, famous German-British philosopher of language, maybe the most important philosopher of the 20th century. So Wittgenstein says that an authentic religious thinker is like a tightrope walker. That when you look from a distance, it looks like they're walking on air, right? To a certain extent, to be an authentic religious thinker, it looks like you're doing something impossible, right? To truly believe, because we live in a world where true belief often kind of seems impossible, and to not only have belief, but to find the strength to move forward when it seems impossible is in itself like nothing less than, a miracle, right? That's the way Avraham essentially lives his life. And as we probably are all familiar with, right? There's the famous midrash that describes Avraham, right? Avraham ha'ivri. What is it that makes Avraham ha'ivri, right? According to the midrash, right? Well, he comes from the other side of the rivers, right? The Aram Naharaim, right? Mesopotamia has the two famous rivers. But the way the midrash understands it is that it's as if the entire world was on one side of the river and as if Avraham was on the other side of the river all by himself, right? That Avraham on his own finds a way to, so to speak, stand against the world, right? And if you're going to stand against the world, that requires you to do something impossible. Because when everybody's going this way, I mean, you probably all know this, right? If you're in a situation with a large group, everybody's doing one thing, for you to do the opposite feels like impossible, right? It just feels like it can't be done, right? And to do that requires, again, courage, strength, right? It requires intestinal fortitude. It requires you, as Rashi said, to be able to basically draw strength solely from yourself, right? Because you can't draw it from anything around you, because everything around you is telling you to do the opposite. Now, the Piaseczner Rebbe is very drawn to this sort of characteristic of Avraham that he sort of can. If you're familiar with Baron Munchausen, right? He's the man who pulled himself up by his own britches, is the in the book. Right, this idea being that somehow, which you can't do obviously physically, it's like from a physics perspective, that's not possible. But Avram is the person who basically can pull himself up on his own entirely. Right, he can do the impossible. He can walk on his own. Now, the reason this idea is so important to Piaseczner Rebbe is because, again, of the circumstances that he is in. Right, when you're in a moment where there is tragedy, where there is suffering, where there is trauma, right? To be able to continue life in any kind of way feels like it is something impossible. It just feels like it can't happen. Like how can the people in the Yeshuvim by Aza like go back there after everything that happened, right? Like it just doesn't seem like it can be done, right? Like right now, many of them are at hotels and they're down by En Gedi or they're all over the place. Like how are they supposed to go back when such a horrific tragedy and trauma has taken place? It just doesn't seem like something you can do. But that's exactly the kind of circumstance that the Piaseczner Rebbe was called to address in the ghetto, right? Under situations, under circumstances of impossibility where religious life seemingly can't happen, your loved ones are dying, you're suffering, you're starving. Like, what are we even supposed to be doing here? Yet somehow, again, as Jews, we have to find a way. So this particular drasha, the Piaseczner Rebbe wants to sort of understand what does it mean to truly be a Jew, somebody who calls Avram Avinu, right? I'll just note, Noach's actually our father too, right? Noach, we're all descended from Noach, right, as Jews. We don't call him Noach Avinu. We only call Avram Avinu, which in a sense means if we're talking about looking at these two, there's only one who we truly see as the model that we are trying to be like, right? And if we're going to be, B'nai Avraham, so to speak, right, then we have to learn this particular attribute of what does it mean to continue in the face of the impossible? What does it mean for the whole world to be on one side and you to suddenly find yourself on the other? And do you want to just run to be with everybody else? Or can you somehow find the impossible strength to stay where you are? So for the Piaseczner Rebbe, this unique ability of Avraham is derived from probably the Jewish people's greatest attribute, but the greatest attribute that is also the source of the Jewish people's greatest failures. And what the Piaseczner Rebbe attributes it to is the concept of Am Kshei Oref, right? That we are a stiff-necked people. Now, for the Piaseczner Rebbe, right, he really hones in on this idea of what does it mean to be Am Kshei Oref through a conversation that God and Moshe have after the golden calf, right? If you're familiar with the story, Egel Zahav, right, Moshe comes down from the mountain, he sees the people worshiping it, he smashes the tablets, destroys the idol, rallies the Leviim and others, and they go kill a bunch of idol worshipers. Now, in the lead up to this, when God tells Moshe this is happening, God wants to destroy the people, right? They're sinners, they betrayed the covenant, right? We're going to destroy them, we're going to start again with Moshe. Moshe convinces God not to destroy the people, but God still has a caveat, right? God doesn't forgive them completely. God tells Moshe, basically, the plan was I was going to dwell in the Mishkan. I was going to dwell amongst the people. I was going to be with them throughout all the journeys in the desert. After all that they've done now, I can't be with them. I'm going to send an angel instead. And God says, I can't be with them because they're Am Kshei Oref. They're a stiff-necked people. I just can't do it. Now, it's striking what the Piaseczner Rebbe notes here is that Moshe, again, wants to defend the people. Moshe is basically going to beg God, don't send an angel. We need you, God, to be amongst us. But the question is, what's Moshe's argument going to be here? Anybody remember this? I didn't even catch this until I was reading the Piaseczner Rebbe. What's Moshe's argument why God shouldn't send an angel? Right? Anybody remember? If you don't, it's fine.
Is it what will the Goyim say?
So that's what he says on Har Sinai when God first tells him about Chet Egel. So what's fascinating is what Moshe says to God is, God, you got to go with them. You can't send an angel because they're Am Kshei Oref. They're a stiff-necked people. And this doesn't make sense to Piaseczner Rebbe notes, right? Why can the cause of their sin, right, also be the reason that God should forgive them and go with them, right? So what the Piaseczner Rebbe goes on to argue is that being stiff-necked is a profound attribute. But I think, as we all know, if you spend time with Jews and recognize that they're stiff-necked, right, it can be the best thing about us and the worst thing about us, right? So here's how I'll read you the Hebrew and I'll translate how the Piaseczner Rebbe understands what it means to be a stiff-necked people. He says, "Aval inyan kshei oref hi achat ha'ma'alot hachi tovot." Right, being stiff-necked is actually one of the greatest attributes a person can have, and this is significant because normally when we look at Chumash, we see the Jewish people called stiff-necked by God, by Moshe. It's almost always like a negative thing, right? We rarely conceive it as a good thing. But the Piaseczner Rebbe is trying to argue, no. That's why Moshe invoked it, to defend the Jewish people, because there is something profound about being stiff-necked, something that is incredibly important. He continues, he says, Ki mi she'eno kshei oref hafachfach v'kalhu. If you're not kshe oref, you are hafachfach, which basically means like you flip all the time, right? You're never on the same position for very long, right? And you're called, you're light, you're a pushover, right? You don't actually have committed beliefs, enduring beliefs, and you stick to them. Instead, you sort of kind of go with whatever people around you are thinking, or you kind of go with whatever in right now. Or if somebody applies enough pressure, they're going to be able to get you to change how you think. Pam kachu, pam kachu. One day you think this, the next day you think that. Ein yocholim lihigamerimon. With a person who's not stiff-necked, you can't actually come to a real agreement with them about things. Because if you try to come to an agreement, there's no confidence that you can have that they're actually going to stick with it, right? Like, because again, they agreed today, but who knows what tomorrow is going to bring. Right now, the person who's not stiff-necked may act as if they want to worship God, serve God, they want to be a good Jew, but you don't really know what tomorrow is going to bring. Tomorrow they could be like, I'm tired, I'm bored, I've got a cold, whatever it is, right? Like they can totally change their mind. And probably the greatest danger of not being stiff-necked is that when you experience a nisayon, when you experience something that tests and tries and puts pressure on you, you're not going to be able to withstand it, right? You're basically just going to fold. He says, Masha ein kenek she'oref, but the one who is stiff-necked is different. Ish yashar, right? They are straight. Right? A person who is stiff-necked, like they say what they're going to do, right? They're not giving you double talk, right? They're going to do it and they're going to stick to it. You can like trust them, right? You can count on them, right? No matter what, because they have commitments and they hold to them. And the stiffer your neck, the more you're going to be able to withstand tests and trying times. If you come to those experiences, and we all do, obviously, right? But it is bad, it is wicked, it is dangerous if you basically use your stiff-neckedness for bad things, right? So this is the point that the PSS everybody wants to make here about what does it mean to be kshe oref, that there's something profound about the way it reflects our stubborn commitments to things, no matter what, and that without it, right, we are just going to go blowing with the wind. And part of what's so important here for the PSS, the Rebbe, and the way he understands Moshe, is that what Moshe is trying to say to God is like, yes, the Jewish people, they did worship idols. We know that. They worshiped the golden calf. They worshiped idols in Egypt, right? Be patient with them. Because when they finally commit to you, right, they are stiff-necked. They are stubborn. They're never going to let go, right? They're going to hold to the covenant, to the brit, no matter what kind of pressures are applied to them, right? Because you have to be stiff-necked to like stay in a covenant, to stay in your commitments to those people that you love, right? Like I think every parent kind of knows this. You have to be stubborn as a parent if you're going to really love and be there for your children, because there are going to become moments where you're going to say to yourself, oh my God, I wish I could just walk away from this, right? And you have to stubbornly hold to them no matter what, right? It is not an easy thing to do by anyone's measure, right? But for Pia Setzner, that ability to have stubborn commitments that you hold on to no matter what is really, really worth something, right? It may be the only thing that's worth something in a certain sense, because without it, right, everything is just skin deep. Everything is superficial. Everything can change tomorrow. Now, part of the reason I appreciate what the PSS Rebbe is doing here is that, again, when we sort of look at our current moments here in Israel, right, there's no question in my mind that Israel's most serious problems are in many ways caused by the stiff-neckedness of the Jewish people. And at the same time, if there are going to be solutions, they're also going to come from the Jewish people being this stiff-necked people. Right? Part of the way being stiff-necked is a problem is that your stubbornness prevents you from seeing things that are right around you, right? Typically, if you're stiff-necked, it sort of means like you can only look in one direction, right? Which means you're ignoring everything else that's either to the side or behind or something like that, right? And again, life in Israel is often dependent on that to a certain extent, right? What can we not look at so we can focus on what's important here, right? But the problem is what you don't look at in this place are often the things that are most problematic and most important. And you saw that, again, playing out in the lead up to to the army, to the intelligence's lack of awareness of what was going on, in a greater sense that sort of the status quo situation with Gaza, with the West Bank, with the Palestinians in general is something that can just sort of, we can keep doing what we're doing, everything is going to be, okay, right? And again, what the PSS Rebbe is noting is that when we are sort of fixated and stubbornly attached to certain beliefs, if they're the wrong beliefs, right, if it prevents us from seeing the larger picture, right, then we have a real, fundamental problem on our hands here. Now, to get at a little bit more about why being stiff-necked is so important, and again, I part of the reason I love this is I was a shul rabbi, and Rabbi Karb can probably attest to this. Rabbi Hart, sorry. Nobody is more aware, and Rabbanit Yael too. Is it Maharat, Rabbanit, Rabba? I don't know what do we use.
Rabbanit, thank you.
Rabbanit. So I guess right. So nobody is more aware of how stiff-necked the Jewish people are, for better and for worse, than rabbis, right? Nobody, because you get to see the best of the stiff-neckedness of the Jewish people. I mean, I saw members of my shul do things that were like almost made me come to tears in the most impossible circumstances, under all sorts of very complicated conditions. And I also saw the worst of it. I saw stiff-necked members of my shul do things to each other, to the community, that honestly also made me want to cry, with how blindly destructive it ultimately was. So I think rabbis get this. I mean, we really, really get this for good, and for bad, that it can lead to miracles and it can lead to, self-annihilation. And the rabbi's job is sometimes just to be in the midst of this while this is all happening. But there's another dimension here that the PSF already gets at about Kshei Aref that is really, really fascinating. I think it's particularly relevant right now. He cites a Talmudic story where the idea appears from Masechet Sanhedrin. And part of what makes the story so interesting is it is this story of two Jews who are taken captive by a non-Jew. So it's taken captive by a non-Jew in Har Carmel, somewhere in Israel. And the non-Jew makes them parade in front of him on the road. And just from this initial framing, right, like we have a particular sensitivity right now for what it means to be held captive. It was a more common Jewish condition than we often realize in Jewish history. There's a lot of halachic sources, rabbinic sources that are dealing with captives. But for the last century or so, we don't typically think about it so much as a common Jewish condition. So when we see a story that sort of brings us to that place, we can't help but think of the Jews who are in Gaza right now. And what the story gets at is to be a captive is to be in an impossibly difficult position, right? Because you are terrified for your life, right? You're powerless. You don't know what's going to happen to you, right? And you know that it could easily end in your death. So what happens in this story, the Jews are walking down the road, their non-Jewish captor is behind them, and the two Jews looked ahead of them on the road and they see a camel. And one Jew says to the other that by looking at the camel and looking at the details of information around the camel, they're able to deduce a whole series of conclusions about what's going on up ahead of them. Right, so I'll just read it to you briefly. This is what one Jew says to the other. Right, this is sort of an example of like the Yiddish cup. Right, like the Jew is able to kind of like see things using deductive reasoning that like the Goyim can't figure out or don't get. Right, so here's what the Jew says: there's a camel in front of us. It's blind in one eye. And it's carrying two jugs, one of wine and one of oil. And there are two people. There's two people leading that camel. One is a Jew and one is a non-Jew. Right? This is what the Jew is able to deduce looking up ahead. Now, the non-Jewish captor hears them saying this, and he immediately turns to the Jews and he says, "Am Sheoref, Meinata Yodin." Right? He's basically saying to them, "You stiff-necked Jews, how the heck do you know that's what's going on up there with that camel?" Right? He's just kind of surprised and kind of shocked at sort of the arrogance of the Jews, that they think that they can like deduce all of this like going on up ahead of them. And so the Jew then turns to the non-Jew and says, "Well, you know what? Here's how we know this." And he goes on to describe how they know this, that the camel is blind in one eye because they see that the camel's only eating food on one side. It only, like when it eats, it only goes towards like one side where the grass is. And the reason they know that it's carrying two jugs, one of wine and one of oil, is that the wine, when it drips out, it drips into the ground. It like soaks up in the ground. Whereas the oil, when it drips out, it just kind of lands on the top and stops there because oil won't sink in. And the fact that they know that there's two Jews leading, a Jew and a non-Jew leading that camel up in front, is because they look ahead and they see that when one of the people leading the camel goes to the bathroom, it does it like in the middle of the road, right? He just urinates in the middle of the road. That must be a non-Jew. Non-Jews aren't particularly modest about how they go to the bathroom, the Gemara says, where the other person is going off the road to sort of like, go in the bushes. That must be a Jew because they're going to do it modestly. And when the non-Jew hears all of these deductions, right, the non-Jew is just amazed because he realizes that these Jews who he's held captive are actually able to figure this whole thing out. And the Gemara goes on to say he takes them to his home, he kisses them on his head, he has a big suda for them. He's so like impressed by the Jews, this Yiddish cup, right, even though they were captive. And he actually lets them go free and even says, blessed are these descendants of Avraham Avinu. Now, it's an interesting story, right? If only it was the case that, captives could convince their captors to like free them due to their, brilliance, their charm, their charisma, whatever, right? It doesn't usually exactly work out that way. But in this story, that's what happens. But for the PSS and the Rebbe, what's important is the fact that the non-Jew describes the Jews here as kshei oref, right, as stubborn. And it's a strange example. In what way are the Jews being stiff-necked, stubborn here when they make these series of deductions? And here's what the PSS and the Rebbe sort of gets at. He notes that if you are held captive, if you are experiencing profound, overwhelming tsuris, right, what is most likely going to happen to you in those circumstances is that you're going to lose your head, right? You're not going to be able to focus. You're not going to be able to grasp anything that is going on around you because it's just simply too overwhelming, right? In the language of the PSS, he says that if you're held captive, right, on impossible circumstances, it's mima'et the chochma, right? It kind of like reduces your ability to think clearly entirely. And what the PSS therapy highlights here is that the reason that the non-Jew calls the Jews kshei oref, stiff-necked, is because even when they're held captive, even when they're in impossible circumstances of suffering and pain, and as we know, when you're suffering and in pain, it feels like everything is being taken away from you. You lose yourself, right? What the PSS therapy argues is the Jews are stiff-necked enough to believe that when they are suffering, when they are in pain, when they are held captive, they can still stubbornly be who they really are. And who they really are the kinds of people who can wisely, analytically look ahead and kind of actually figure out what is actually going on, right? And I think for me, this was so profound when I first saw this, because what it is getting at is stiff-necked isn't just stubbornness to sort of persevere, right? Like in the face of the impossible, right? Stiff-necked is being stubborn to hold on to who you really are. And in a moment in which it feels like everything is collapsing, right, the easiest thing in the world is to feel like you can just lose who you really are, right? To be able to stubbornly hold on to who you are in the face of the impossible, right, just doesn't seem like things you're supposed to do, right? In a moment when you face things that are inhuman, right, you're not supposed to hold on to your humanity, right? There's a lot of television commentators right now in Israeli news, like constantly debating about how Israel should respond. And one of the themes that you hear from certain people, certain voices, right, is that, again, this idea that we live in the Middle East, right, this is a place where you basically have to show you are stronger and tougher than anybody else. And the way you do that is by killing as many people as you can, right? That's the argument that is offered, repeatedly. And there's some truth to that if you look at the history of many of the countries around here and how dictatorships are maintained, how they oppress, any kind of, popular democracy of any kind, and how so much of, again, the world just turns a blind eye to that, right? That's what they do over there. What can you do, right? To be able to hold on to who you are in impossible circumstances, to hold on to your humanity in the face of that which is inhumane, requires a profound stubbornness. It requires an obstinacy and a commitment to who you are, even when you feel like that is being literally stripped away and taken from you. And that is something we should never really underestimate, that Jews aren't just stubborn, that they keep going, right? Jews are stubborn to hold on to what matters most to them, exactly at the moments when it feels like everything is being taken away. And the last point I want to emphasize a bit here, and then maybe we'll open up for a little bit of discussion, is this question of what does Am Kshei Oref enable us when it comes to the sort of opposition or antagonism or enemies that the Jewish people ultimately face, here in the world. And again, just the fact that Jews hold on to who they are in the face of the impossible, right? That Jews are stubborn enough to think and to act in the face of the impossible. I do just want to highlight for a moment that what took place on October 7th on Simchat Torah, right? There are countless stories of Jews just, holding on to who they are in the face of the impossible, when it feels like that should be taken away, from them, right? The Jews who are stubborn enough to run towards those yeshivim near Gaza when the army wasn't even going there the first several hours, simply because there are people who are dying and there's nobody there to help them or be with them. And then people were literally running into the face of the impossible doing that. I mean, you can watch the videos, you can see the stories. I mean, it's literally undescribable what these people were doing, going down those roads, facing Hamas terrorists, entering these settlements, trying to help people. Like, it is the Kshei Oref that is required to do that is something I don't think many of us can really, really understand. Or the simple, the idea that the Kshei Oref, the stiff-neckedness of what it means to be a parent with young kids in a miklat, in a protected room for 12, 14 hours, right? While there are terrorists outside and God knows what's gonna come, or just the Kshei Oref of Israeli society in response to all of this, right? What it means, how stubborn you have to be to go to funeral after funeral, shiva after shiva, because that a Jew doesn't mourn alone, right? That somebody has to be there for them, right? Even if it doesn't make sense, even if you can barely find the strength to do that, right? So there is a way in which Kshei Oref enables perseverance in the face of the impossible, and enables Jews to do what Jews are supposed to do, which is to do mitzvot, even when it seems like it can't be done. That is the fundamental challenge. And that is something, again, on that Simchas Torah and all of those yeshuvim and Be'eri and Kfar Aza, all of those places, I guarantee you Jews were praying and Jews were doing mitzvot, right? Even in the face of the impossible, because that's what a stubborn, stiff-necked Jew is ultimately supposed to do. And, we always, we have to hold that space, that reality, even when it feels or felt like everything was falling apart. But the last point I really want to make here about Kshei Oref is, again, relation to the other, relation to our antagonists or to the enemies, which, again, are strong language. Much of the sort of conversation here in Israel has been about, we have to come together as a people so we can wipe out the enemies, so we can wipe out Hamas, right? The big slogan that you see pretty much everywhere is Yachad Ninatzeach, right? Together we will, achieve victory, essentially. And again, the assumption there is that if you're going to achieve victory, you're going to do it on the battlefield, and you're going to do it by wiping out the enemy, right? And for a lot of people, again, a lot of the Israeli mentality, being a stiff-necked Jew, is about being tougher and stronger than everybody else around, right? And we're going to be tougher and stronger so that they're going to be afraid of us, right? And that's what it means to be an Am Kshei Oref. That was what it means, like it says about Abraham, to sort of walk by his own strength. We're going to be tougher. We're going to be stronger than everybody else. And if we have to be on this side of the river and everybody else on the other side, it's because, again, we're tougher and stronger than everybody else, and we're going to defeat them. We're going to, wipe them out. But that's the kind of language, the discourse that you hear here. But again, I think we have to know by Abraham. Abraham was not the strongest, toughest guy in the Middle East. I mean, I think that should be, he knew how to fight, but clearly, his life was at risk at many points. And when we think about, quote unquote, victory, so to speak, I think there is victory of a different kind by virtue of the fact that Jews are called Am HaNetzach, right? The eternal people. And the idea that we are an eternal people is very much a reflection of our Kshei Oref, of our stubbornness, of our stubborn commitments to who we are and our perseverance in the face of the impossible, right? Because to be a stiff-necked nation does not mean you defeat your opponents on the battlefield, right? It actually doesn't work that way at all, right? All the nations that oppressed us, the great ones, right? Egypt, right? The Babylonians, right? The Romans. We didn't really defeat any of them on the battlefield, right? We defeated them by virtue of, it wasn't Yachad Ninatzeach. We all rallied together and overcame them, right? We defeated them to a large extent by virtue of still being here, right? And what I think sometimes gets lost, especially in our current moment, but I think the PSS will be understood, is that Kshei Oref isn't about defeating the other. It isn't about being strong enough where you can destroy your enemies. It's about being stubborn enough that you're going to be here tomorrow and the day after and the day after. that you are fighting not to defeat your enemies, but that you are fighting to live, right? And that stubbornness to still be here, even when everybody else says the Jews should have been long gone by now, right? It is that stubbornness that enables us to overcome our enemies, right? It is that stubbornness that enables us to, again, be, Am HaNetzach, however we want to ultimately understand that to mean. Nobody understood, probably better than the Piasetzner Rebbe, that being Am Sheoref doesn't always mean being the strongest, right? Because he understood that what the Jews represented in the Warsaw Ghetto was Am Sheoref, right? And their ability to maintain some kind of religious, spiritual life. They were not stronger militarily or physically, right, than the Nazis around them. They just weren't, right? But the reason that they were able to defeat them, so to speak, is their stubborn commitment to still being here, right? To make it to tomorrow, and doing so in a way that means being stubbornly committed to who you really are, to what matters most, right? To God, Torah, to your fellow Jews, and not letting go of that, even when the pressure and the suffering and the pain wants to take everything away, right? Because that's what it does. And if we let it take everything away, then to a certain extent, we stop being Jews, right? It is the persistent commitment to those things that matter most, that enable us to still be here. I guess I'll just, again, conclude with what Rashi says, right? Kafisha Rashi is beer. Noach hayat tzarich sad l'tomcho, that Noach required God's help. About Avraham, ha'av la'am she'oref, Avraham, who is the father of the stiff-necked people, haya mitchazek v'holech b'tzidko me'alav. Right, he goes through the strength and the righteousness that comes from who he is. Right, the stubborn commitment to who he is, no matter what, in the face of the impossible. And I think we are living in a moment again. I mean, without getting into a lot of details, that first week of the war was pretty terrifying, I have to be honest. I am somebody who, is willing to confront that I'm going to die and that terrible things can happen. But there was a moment, I'll say, that first week when there was a false alarm about a massive drone incursion from Lebanon. I don't know if people even remember this. It was honestly, there was a moment I was huddled with my family, and I had to ask myself, like, is this, like, are we about to watch the gates of hell open up right here? Like, not knowing what's gonna come. So there have been a lot, and I mean, that was a small taste of what many other people around Israel have experienced much worse, whether due to rockets, whether due to the actual attacks, whether due to watching loved ones go up in the army and not knowing what's going to happen, or just people who are desperately afraid of what's going to happen in Gaza to Palestinians, right? How many thousands of Palestinian children are going to die before it's all is said and done? And what is that going to mean for all of us, right? Like, there are so many moments of I would say, the terrifying and possible here. And the only way you can answer those moments is by that stubborn commitment to who you are, and that stubborn commitment to be here tomorrow. And that is not an easy thing, but it may be the only thing that has gotten the Jewish people through these kinds of moments. So I'll end there and happy to open up for some questions or comments or anything.
Zach, I just want to thank you personally. That was it's beautiful. Thank you. I have to go. I'm actually going off to Evanston High School to talk with Jewish high school students who are feeling afraid. And so I'm gonna sign off. But if I know you have a hard stop, Rav Zach, but if people have a minute or two to stick on, that's great. But I do just want to say thank you and Yasher Koach, and thank you for this really important Torah right now, and for everything just you're doing. And we're with you. We love you. We stand with you. And we'll keep our necks stiff.
Look, in a certain sense, Ari, like, the most important things we can do in a sense is like go to shul to daven, right? Like, give tzedakah, be there when people like are opening their arms and saying, I need help. And hearing that call, that like there are moments, like I'm sure you heard when the young child was killed, like where you just feel that compulsion, like that call that you have to be there, and just like being stiff-necked and stubborn enough to just like to go, right? Like, and I think this isn't a moment about deep thoughts to a large extent. It's not about being purely reactive either, but it is about holding, true to who we are, and the things that, again, we feel bound to, right? The things that matter most to us.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Amen.
While people think of their questions, if they have them, just a reminder that next week we are lucky to learn with Rabbi Anat Sharbat in Israel, and topic coming soon. But if anyone has questions for Rabbi Truboff, please feel free to share.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. It reminds me of what, I guess it's also a Rashi on, like, in Egypt, that the Jews kept their names, like bring me whatever the things were that they did. And I think that's kind of pointing to the same thing, is that in the end, and being like, it is almost like the whole world makes us stand alone. It isn't just that this is our identity and that we're choosing this in this minute. It's also that being in spaces with non-Jews feels not safe, and does make us like very aware of our identity in these moments.
Right, but I want to point out, I mean, Jews pretty much throughout their entire history, certainly modernity, always have that option of taking off that kippah, taking off that Jewish star, and saying, like, I'm not going to be a Jew anymore. Like, it's not worth it, right? So yes, the non-Jewish identity sometimes like helps us be more self-aware of like who we are, but it still requires a stiff-neckedness to to commit to it. Look, I forgot to mention that PSS the Rebbe also makes this point where he says the Jews are actually greater than the angels, because when the angels come to this world, they can't go right back up to heaven afterwards. Because once they're in this world, the world impacts them, it changes them, it puts, influences them, and they have to sort of spiritually prepare themselves and cleanse themselves before they can go back up to heaven to serve God. And as the Rebbe points out, but by the Jews, that's not the case. We're in this world exerts tremendous pressures on us, and yet we're still able to serve God, right? And he actually notes that this is a midrash in the Zohar, right? That just as God is Ani Hashem Lo Shaniti, that God is unchanging, to a certain extent, that's what makes God eternal. That's what makes God God, right? That God doesn't change. And if the Jewish people are to reflect or represent God in the world, it is that, in a certain sense, we don't change either, that we're still here, that we still remain committed to those fundamental things that make us who we are in the face of unbelievable opposition and pressure, when it just seems like impossible. And that's not even something angels can do, in a sense, right? Like, that's something that only maybe Jews in this world know how to do, to hold on to Judaism, to hold on to Jewishness. Again, when it just seems impossible, to just stay where you are, even when the whole world says, go away or get on our side of the line, like, we just stand still. And there's something very, profound about that.
Beautiful. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's tough that Jews just stand still. I don't want to be obvious, like it's not, I'm not trying to romanticize all of this, right? There is this downside to Kshay Rorif, but we have to kind of hold both at the same time. And I desperately pray that this crisis will be an impetus for Israel and the Jewish people to do tshuva on a variety of levels. And not so much because, we're sinners and we have to change per se, like this, we've caused this, but more so that crisis, like I said, maybe the only opportunity we really have to change. And being stiff-necked means oftentimes you need a much bigger crisis to be able to open yourself up to the possibility that maybe you have to think about things differently. And I do hope that we can, that's the beauty of the Jews. We stay committed, even when we hit those moments that forces us to rethink everything, right? But in rethinking everything, we don't just break from what came before. We find ways to reinterpret it. We find ways to hold on to it even as it changes, but still can be the same in a sense, right? So that's the real challenge ahead of us, right? Everybody keeps talking here, so everything's going to be different. Everything's going to change after this. That can be good and bad, to be honest. I think the real challenge is holding on to who we are, but recognizing that how we understand who we are and the world around us may have to change.
If I could add, I found this very moving. Thank you very much. Because I think day by day, we're finding that we are standing increasingly alone in the world. We are a people who stand alone. And I think what you said is really very motivating to keep us strong. And I found it very moving. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And what I appreciate about this too is it's not about them. It's not about the enemy, the bad people, the people who are oppressing us. We're Kshay Oref independent of them, right? We're going to be stubborn and sticking who we are. It's just when they start putting pressure, then we become aware of how stubborn we have to be, right? It's not, but it really isn't about them. It's about us. It's about our commitments, right? Their pressure just forces us to be more conscious of them. And I think that's also important because, again, if it's about an antagonism that we have to eliminate, right? Like we have to, get rid of all those people who don't get Israel properly and all those evil anti-Semites. That's not the point, right? Jews are still here because we defeated all the anti-Semites, because we convinced all the anti-Semites they shouldn't be anti-Semites, right? We're still here because we just remain committed to who we are, no matter what.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff. I know you have to go as well. So thank you. And we look forward to connecting again in better times.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone. As we say, B'sorot Tovot, and keep being stiff-necked and stubborn, committed to what matters most right now.
Amen.